The sea was dark, the wind cut like a knife, and at the bow of that ship 2 men stood in silence. Gunnar Vingren, young, Swedish, father of small children, a pastor who could have chosen safety, but did not. Behind him were the quiet streets of Sweden, the laughter of his children, the gentle warmth of his wife, a simple and safe life. At his side, Daniel Berg, faithful friend, a blacksmith with calloused hands and a surrendered heart, leaving behind not only his homeland, but any plan that was not to obey the call of God. Ahead of them, Brazil, the north, the edge of the Amazon jungle. The reports were frightening. The map turned too green in that region. Forests so dense the sun barely touched the ground. Wide rivers where anacondas disappeared like living shadows. Jaguars that watched without being seen. Indigenous peoples known for defending their lands with fierce precision. And tropical fevers, invisible, fast, deadly. Even faced with all this, they kept going. Not because they were fearless, but because they carried a conviction that gave them no rest. Months earlier, in a simple prayer meeting in Chicago, an unexpected word had been spoken by a brother who knew nothing about Brazil. Pará. It was just a name, but it fell on Gunnar with weight and ended up binding them both to the same destiny. When they opened the map and saw where it was, in the north of Brazil, on the edge of the Amazon, so far from everything familiar, they understood it was not an impulse, but a calling. From that day on, fear remained real, but it no longer had authority. Before we go on, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, subscribe. Every week we share accounts that rekindle faith. The journey that begins here is not about extraordinary men, but about the God who sent them beyond anything reason would allow. Stay until the end, because together we will see how the call of God can cross oceans and set hearts on fire. Gunnar Vingren was born in 1879 in a Swedish village where winter seemed to last for months and the silence of the mountains shaped the character of men. His family was simple, hard-working, marked by a faith that made no noise, yet sustained every sunrise. His father read the scriptures by the light of an oil lamp, and Gunnar grew up hearing the sound of pages turning while the wind beat against the windows. It was there, between the smell of burning wood and melting snow, that he learned God speaks first in the silence. What he did not know was that this early silence would prepare the ground for a calling that would cross continents. As a teenager, Gunnar stood out for an unusual sensitivity. He was calm, observant, shy. He preferred walking alone through the fields to joining parties. There was a restlessness in him that no one could name. And while many young people dreamed of staying close to their families, Gunnar sensed, though without understanding, that his life would be led far away. That feeling grew when he began attending the local Baptist youth meetings. The fervor of those gatherings, the long prayers, the simple hymns, everything seemed to touch him in a different way. He would leave feeling as if something had been lit inside his chest, but he still did not know what to do with it. The years passed, and an unexpected opportunity appeared to study theology in the United States. Traveling so far meant leaving everything he knew, but something inside said he needed to go. Some relatives tried to convince him to stay. "America is too big," they said, "and you are a quiet man." Yet that warning opened a quiet question in his heart. What if God was calling him precisely for that reason? He had no answer, only a growing inner push. When he arrived in Chicago, the culture shock was immediate. The city was loud, full of smoke, carriages, a mix of accents, factories, and a pace that swallowed the distracted. Yet there he found a new spiritual home, a small prayer group seeking a deeper experience with God. Those meetings carried the distant echo of Azusa Street in Los Angeles, the revival that was spreading a new hunger for the Holy Spirit around the world. Many nights, the gatherings lasted past midnight, and Gunnar sensed that inner flame burning strong again. It was in those meetings that he met Daniel Berg, a younger Swede, strong, with hands calloused by blacksmith's work. Daniel was simple, but had a vibrant, almost childlike faith that balanced Gunnar's introspective sensitivity. The two recognized each other as brothers almost instantly. They talked about faith, about the future, about what God could do with ordinary men willing to obey. The fire that had burned in Azusa was now unfolding in small rooms like that one, where the two prayed night after night. Something in their friendship felt inevitable, as if God had been stitching their stories together long before they met. One particularly quiet night, the unexpected happened. A brother stood up with a pale face, like someone wrestling with words he did not know how to say. He took a deep breath and murmured, "Pará." That was all, a single word, thrown like a seed. Gunnar felt his body go cold. The name sounded strange, distant, heavy. Daniel noticed his friend's reaction, but neither of them understood yet what it meant. Still, a door had been opened, and they would walk through it long before they fully realized it. In the days that followed, the word Pará pursued Gunnar at the most unlikely moments, upon waking while praying, walking through the streets of Chicago. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just emotion. But the weight grew. Why that name? Why that faraway country? The doubt followed him until the afternoon he opened a world map and found Pará in the far north of Brazil. He saw the vast green of the Amazon, colossal rivers cutting through the land, cities that seemed isolated from the world. It was not a common destination. It was an abyss for someone like him. And yet, something inside Gunnar trembled as confirmation. He closed his eyes and prayed, "Lord, if this really is your voice, confirm it in my spirit." Daniel, seeing his struggle, began to pray beside him. The two were already walking together and would walk much farther. They never set foot in Azusa, but Azusa, in some way, had reached them. Gunnar did not yet know it, but the calling would not begin at the port, nor in Brazil. It would begin inside his own soul, and what God was about to do would redefine the history of faith in that nation forever. The decision to leave the United States and head for Brazil did not erase their uncertainties. It only confirmed that the path would be difficult. Gunnar Vingren and Daniel Berg boarded a ship in New York at the beginning of November 1910, carrying with them a few clothes, some savings, and the conviction that God was sending them to a place they barely knew. They traveled in third class, like so many poor immigrants of that era, sharing space with workers seeking new opportunities. The ship was simple, and the crossing lasted 2 weeks. There are no records of violent storms or great scares along the way, but there was something deeper than the weather, the weight of responsibility they both carried. Gunnar, especially, felt the distance from his family like a constant knot in his chest. He knew he had left behind a devoted wife and small children. He knew that, for months, perhaps years, he would not be present to help them. And though he believed God would take care of them, the longing began even before they reached their destination. Daniel, in turn, had left behind the life of hard work and stability he had built in the United States. He was single, but that did not lessen the cost of his surrender. Both had said yes to a call they still did not know how to live out in practice. When they finally sighted the Brazilian coast and arrived in Belém do Pará on the 19th of November 1910, the cultural shock was unavoidable. The city was hot, humid, full of unfamiliar sounds. Street vendors shouting, animals moving along the roads, boats docking at the port, and a mix of aromas that included ripe fruit, fresh fish, and local spices. For men coming from cold countries, that intense climate felt almost like a physical blow. The Portuguese language sounded fast and musical, but hard to understand. The world around them seemed too new, too vast. Historical sources record that in those first days, Gunnar and Daniel faced immediate practical difficulties. They had nowhere to stay, knew no one in the city, and there was no support structure ready to receive them. What they had were a few letters of recommendation written before the trip, and even then, they did not know if those letters would help. They began by visiting addresses suggested by other believers, knocking on doors and introducing themselves with simplicity. Little by little, some people started to help. Brazilian hospitality, often mentioned in accounts from that time, opened the first doors. Even so, the beginning was modest, marked by uncertainty and constant adjustments. The greatest difficulty, however, was not material. It was spiritual. Gunnar and Daniel carried with them the Pentecostal message that had been growing in the United States after the Azusa Street revival. But Belém was a city with strong religious traditions, and many received with caution anything that seemed new or strange. The two missionaries needed discernment to know when to speak, when to wait, and when simply to listen. There was no rush, but there was an inner urgency that reminded them of the call that had brought them there. During this time, prayer became the foundation of everything. Historical records preserve many references to the lifestyle of prayer they maintained, long periods seeking direction, personal consecration, dependence on God for every step. It was not about dramatic emotions, but about a constant, reverent discipline. And in the moments when homesickness pressed hard, or when cultural barriers seemed too strong, it was in prayer that they found comfort. Some hardships were inevitable. The intense heat caused exhaustion. The food was different, communication was limited, and like any newly arrived foreigners, they faced the feeling of not fully belonging to that place. Even so, accounts show that the people of Pará showed practical kindness, offering temporary lodging, simple meals, and opportunities for fellowship. Little by little, Gunnar and Daniel began to adapt, watching the city, learning basic Portuguese words, and trying to understand the reality of the people they longed to reach. In the late afternoons, when the streets grew quieter and the heat gave way to a gentle breeze coming from the bay, Gunnar would often reflect on everything he had left behind. He did not leave long emotional writings about this phase, but he mentioned more than once the weight of having left his family. That weight did not pull him away from the mission. It only drove him to seek God's presence even more. It was as if the calling needed to be confirmed daily, not in extraordinary events, but in the simple faithfulness of continuing. It was in this atmosphere of adaptation, prayer, and expectancy that something began to happen. Small conversations started, people showed curiosity, homes opened, and although there were still no clear signs of what God would do in the future, there was a beginning. The work started in a humble, almost invisible way, like a seed buried in the soil before the right season. What Gunnar and Daniel did not know was that this seed would sprout in a way that surpassed any human forecast. Before they experienced the revival that would mark Belém, before they saw lives transformed, before they witnessed the birth of a movement that would reach millions, they needed to pass through this quiet beginning. The pain, the distance, and the absolute dependence were not obstacles. They were foundations. And while Gunnar and Daniel remained faithful in the small days, praying, learning, listening, something subtle began to shift around them. It was not noise, it was not haste. It was simply the quiet sense that God was guiding steps they did not yet understand. And it was in that humble, almost invisible setting that the story began to take shape. The work began in an almost imperceptible way. A conversation here, a visit there, a simple meeting in a home opened out of kindness. Accounts show that not long after their arrival, Gunnar and Daniel were welcomed by the Chamont family, who offered them lodging and, even more importantly, trust. It was in small, everyday environments like that the missionaries began to speak about the experience of the Holy Spirit they had witnessed in the United States. Nothing was grand. Nothing was planned on a large scale, but there was sincerity, reverence, and a spiritual hunger that found an echo in some hearts. Then, slowly, something began to awaken. A small group started meeting for prayer. The gatherings were simple, without instruments, without formality. Some people sought God with tears, others in silence, others with deep questions. Among those early listeners was Selina Albuquerque, a woman who, according to historical records, would become the first believer baptized with the Holy Spirit in Brazil. The impact of that moment cannot be overstated. It was as if a spiritual door had opened in Belém, allowing something new to cross into people's lives. The news spread. Some responded with joy, others with caution, some with opposition, but the meetings increased. The gospel was preached with clarity, and the accounts speak of sincere conversions, reconciliations, and a growing desire for holiness. The strength of the Pentecostal movement was not in human grandeur. It was in the power of God working in simple hearts, and that power began to manifest with intensity. Within a few months, that small group became a growing congregation. There was no temple, there was no structure. There were only open homes, willing hands, and a deep sense that God was doing something beyond their initial expectations. What began as a home meeting became a movement. Gatherings started drawing people from different neighborhoods of Belém. Workers, mothers, curious young people, elderly men and women seeking comfort. Each meeting seemed to carry an atmosphere of awakening, as if the city itself were beginning to sense that something new had arrived. This growth culminated in the official founding of the Assembleia de Deus, Assembly of God, in Belém on the 18th of June 1911. There was no pomp, only 56 initial members, a small number in human eyes yet full of spiritual meaning. The work was born in humility, like a fragile lighthouse placed at the edge of the Amazon, unaware of how far its light would one day reach. As the months passed, more people joined. Meetings were held almost daily. The scriptures were studied deeply. It was common for prayers to stretch late into the night, not because of uncontrolled emotion, but because of a sincere longing for God's presence. Historical reports reveal that Gunnar and Daniel never sought personal prominence. Everything was done with simplicity and reverence, and that simplicity drew even more people. It did not take long for the movement to spread to other cities. Brazilian believers converted in Belém carried the message into the interior of Pará, then into Maranhão, later into the northeast and southeast of the country. Within a few years, what had started with 2 Swedish men in a distant port spread across Brazil like fire in dry grass. The numerical impact is still striking today. The Pentecostal movement that began in that small room in Belém would reach millions in the decades that followed. But numbers do not tell everything. What marked Gunnar and Daniel most was the transformation of real lives. Men once indifferent began to pray with fervor. Broken families found reconciliation. The sick experienced comfort. Hardened hearts were softened. It was the same flame that had burned in Azusa, now blossoming in a unique way in Brazilian soil. It was not about copying the American revival. It was something God was shaping according to the reality of the Amazon, with its narrow streets, vibrant culture, and warm people. Gunnar wrote in his diaries that he often marveled at what he saw. He had not imagined such reach when he left Sweden. Daniel, always steady at his side, kept teaching, serving, translating, and working with his hands. Together, they witnessed one of the most significant movements in 20th century Christian history. Looking back at those early years, it is hard not to see an invisible line connecting each detail. The word Pará, spoken in Chicago, the uncertain voyage, the difficult adaptation, the first humble meeting, the baptism in the Spirit, the unexpected growth, and finally the founding of a work that would cross borders. Nothing seemed grand at the time it happened, yet each step carried the weight of eternity. Today, looking back, it is almost impossible to imagine that it all began like this. Without resources, without crowds, just two men, a Bible, and a calling that would not let them quit. That is why the high point of this story is not just a historical fact. It is a testimony to how God works through simple means with unimaginable results. And now, as you follow this journey, perhaps there is someone on your heart who needs to hear this story. Someone tired, discouraged, or feeling that their small steps mean nothing. If this account speaks to you, share it. Share it with someone who needs to remember that God still does much with what seems small. The years following the beginning of the work in Belém were marked by constant expansion, exhausting travel, and a ministry rhythm that demanded body, mind, and spirit. Gunnar Vingren traveled from city to city through small towns and distant interior regions. He preached in simple homes, improvised halls, porches, public squares, wherever an opportunity appeared. The work was growing quickly, and with that growth came the need to guide new converts, train leaders, discern challenges, and answer the questions that always accompany a young spiritual movement. Gunnar's health, however, did not keep pace with the expansion. Historical records show that throughout the 1920s, he faced repeated bouts of illness. The tropical climate, so different from Sweden's, took a heavy toll. Constant travel by boats, canoes, and rough roads drained his strength. Even so, Gunnar kept serving. Not out of heroics, but out of faithfulness. He did not see himself as the founder of a movement. He saw himself as a servant, and he served while he still had strength. Daniel Berg walked beside him, steady and loyal, used to manual labor and to the ongoing effort of learning Portuguese. While Gunnar preached, counseled, and wrote, Daniel took care of practical details, helped translate hymns, and assisted in organizing the first structures of the church. The partnership that had begun in Chicago continued in Brazil with maturity, respect, and unity. The work flourishing before them now stretched far beyond the borders of Pará. And even so, both kept the same simplicity as in the early days: pray, work, trust. Over time, Gunnar's health worsened. In 1930, he returned to Sweden to seek treatment and rest with the family he loved so deeply. Saying goodbye to Brazil did not feel definitive in his heart. He still hoped to recover and come back. Accounts show that his heart remained tied to the Brazilian people, to the churches he had helped plant, and to the lives he had seen transformed. But his body was already showing clear signs of exhaustion. On June 28, 1933, at the age of 54, Gunnar Vingren passed away in Sweden. He died far from the country where he had invested his best years, but close to the family he had carried in prayer throughout his entire journey. The news crossed the ocean and reached Brazil quickly. Churches gathered, pastors thanked God for his life, and many who had never met him personally recognized, in the simplicity of his story, the mark of someone who had obeyed to the end. Gunnar's immediate legacy was clear. Dozens of congregations planted, workers trained, families restored, and a spiritual movement in full expansion. But the lasting legacy was only beginning to appear. The work he and Daniel had begun in 1911 would, over the decades, become one of the largest Pentecostal movements in the world. Today, the Assembleia de Deus in Brazil has millions of members, reaching cities, villages, capitals, and regions they could never have imagined reaching. Numbers impress, but they do not explain everything. Behind each statistic are real stories, men and women who found hope, young people who discovered purpose, families transformed, entire communities impacted through the gospel. What started with 56 members in Belém became a work that touches the nation from north to south. And this did not happen through human strategy, but through the faithfulness of a God who uses humble instruments to carry out great works. Looking at the life of Gunnar Vingren, a quiet pattern appears. God rarely calls anyone to an easy path. Gunnar's calling led him to leave home, family, safety, and health, and to face distance, heat, limitations, and sickness. But it also led him to witness the birth of something that would go far beyond any human understanding. Obedience is never simple, but it is always fruitful. And perhaps this is exactly where the story meets you. Because each viewer who reaches this point also carries personal callings, challenges, doors that seem too small or too distant. Gunnar's life is not an invitation to heroism, but to faithfulness. God did not need a strong man. He needed a willing man. And that is what he found. So as this story ends, another may be beginning. Not in the streets of Belém, nor in the forests of the north of Brazil, but inside your heart. Perhaps you stand before something that feels too big. Perhaps before something that seems too small. Perhaps you are waiting for the confirmation Gunnar once waited for. And the same voice that sent him may be calling you to take the next step, not in haste, not in fear, but in trust. And Daniel, he remained in Brazil for many years after Gunnar's departure, serving, teaching, walking among the people he had learned to love. His journey is long, beautiful, and deserves to be told with the same care. If you would like to hear the full story of Daniel Berg, write it here in the comments. Who knows? That may be the next chapter we open together. If this story spoke to you, share in the comments what you have been praying for in these days. And if you wish to support this work, your super thanks helps keep stories like this alive, stories that rekindle faith and remind us that God still calls, still sends, still transforms.